This is Moderate Rebels. I'm Ben Norton, joined by my co host Max Blumenthal, and we have a friend of the show back. Actually, I think he's probably the guest we've had more than anyone else. We're speaking with Ali Abunimah. You probably know him. If you don't know him, you definitely should check out the Electronic Intifada. He is the executive director of that great independent news website focusing on apartheid Israel and Palestinian resistance. And today we're going to talk about Joe Biden, the next U.S. president, what his administration will look like, and the future of the Democratic Party under the specter of Barack Obama, he's hanging over the Democratic Party. It's effectively his party now. And Barack Obama just released another memoir. So we're going to talk about what that says about him. But let's talk about Biden, Ali. Let's start with that. Biden is going to be the next president. Donald Trump, who claims that he won the election without any evidence, he basically acknowledged that this week. Today is November 25th, and Trump said that his administration is working toward the transition to the Biden administration. They've all but acknowledged that publicly. So we now know that Biden has several members of his cabinet picked. He's publicly announced them. Secretary of State, his nominee is going to be Antony Blinken. And Blinken is a liberal interventionist, a war hawk. He is a longtime foreign policy advisor to Joe Biden, who worked with him to support the Iraq War. And then fast forward, and under the Obama administration, Blinken was a State Department official, and there he helped oversee the war on Libya. He strongly supported the 2011 NATO war that destroyed the Libyan state and unleashed open-air slave markets in this country. And then Blinken also supported the war in Syria, of course, and further military intervention there. And then Blinken helped start the war in Yemen in 2015, this catastrophic war that has unleashed the largest humanitarian catastrophe on earth. So Blinken has a very hawkish record. He's kind of like Samantha Power. He's one of these liberal interventionist types. And then, of course, something we'll talk about a lot in this episode, Blinken strongly supports apartheid Israel. And that's something that ties together all these candidates. They all strongly support Israel, and at most, their so-called support in scare quotes for Palestinians is just rhetoric. They've done nothing ever to support Palestine. And then there are other members we now know. It's very likely that Biden's defense secretary is going to be Michelle Flournoy, another one of these, creatures of the swamp, of the foreign policy blob, if you will, in D.C., who frequent the revolving door between the government and think tanks on K Street. So she's another apparatchik of these hawkish neoconservative think tanks that are funded by the weapons industry. And we now know that Janet Yellen, the former head of the Fed, is going to be Biden's likely Treasury Secretary. And Yellen, by the way, just 2 years ago in 2018, she called for cutting Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare, and called for more austerity. So I mean, there's very little to hope. I mean, it looks like it's going to be a continuation of the Barack Obama years. And this episode's going to be about Obama. So, Ali, before I go to you, I'll just say that this is going to be a two-part episode. And the second part is going to be about France. And that's something that you've been writing a lot about Emmanuel Macron, who is the neoliberal kind of centrist or center-right president who is going really just authoritarian now. He's trying to out Marine Le Pen, the far-right leader, and he's really cracking down on the Muslim population in France with these Islamophobic policies. He's also pushing through this legislation that's effectively going to try to illegalize filming or photographing the police and police brutality. So that'll be in the second part of this episode. So anyway, Ali, let's just go back to you. Can you just give your thoughts? We now know that Biden's going to be the next president on January 20th, 2021, if he makes it to then. So what do you think so far of the cabinet picks we've seen? And what's the deal with Obama? He just won't go away.
Well, this is just a new day in America, isn't it? Like, finally we can go to brunch, right? Well, I think I tweeted that one American nightmare is ending and another one is beginning, because I think all the worst expectations of Biden are already playing out in terms of who he is appointing to his administration. We're going to talk about Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State nominee, but he's already reappointed John Kerry, who was Barack Obama's Secretary of State. He's appointed Janet Yellen, who was the Federal Reserve chair under Obama, and is another one of these individuals who comes from the same kind of East Coast elite in terms of just the consensus thinking about everything. And so it's very doubtful that there's going to be any kind of massive effort to help the millions of Americans who have been made unemployed or lost health insurance because of the pandemic and the economic disaster that's going on. So it's very hard to see. Oh, and this morning on NPR, they were talking about how Biden is looking to appoint a Republican to his administration because he wants to bring the nation together. What was noticeably absent was any talk of him appointing Bernie Sanders, who wants to be Labor Secretary, apparently. Who knows? Maybe it will happen, but you'd think they'd roll that one out if it was going to happen. And there's also talk of him appointing, investment banker and former Chicago mayor Rahm Emanuel. So those, again, haven't been rolled out, but at least right from the start, there's very little to suggest any kind of fundamental change is going to happen.
And if you mention Rahm Emanuel's name in a negative light on Moderate Rebels, we won't cut the signal like CNN did to Jamal Bowman. If you haven't seen that, just look up, search on Twitter, Jamal Bowman, CNN, and search it anywhere. And you'll see the mighty Wurlitzer went off key for a second and someone pulled the plug. But Ali and Ben, although, you're not here for this great moment, historic moment where Obama is popping into Zoom calls with Chicago public school students to give them free e-copies of his new memoir, where he, has such inspiring passages about his kill list and how he wanted to save those young men, but the machinery at his disposal found him killing them instead. It's a really inspiring time in this country, but America's back, guys. America's back. That's what Biden said when announcing his national security picks. What does that mean, Ali?
Well, I got to say, it sounds more like a threat.
Well, you're ruining the sarcasm here, but
well, he also said not only did he say America's back, but he said that America is, quote, going to lead the world. And we did have an election in this country in which Americans, for better or worse, clearly elected Joe Biden as president of the United States. But I don't recall an election in the rest of the world to elect the United States to lead the world. So I think it really just goes to show how deeply embedded this American exceptionalist mindset is, where the United States has a God-given right to dictate to the rest of the world. And of course, American exceptionalism is really, in a way, just a euphemism for empire. In the mind of Joe Biden and the people around him, American empire is the natural state of affairs. And Donald Trump, to the extent that he deviated from that worldview, even rhetorically, was just beyond the pale. Of course, Trump was a total fraud, and we don't need to keep repeating that he never fulfilled his promises to end the wars. But even saying he wanted to end the wars was enough to set the alarm bells ringing in the deep state, the same deep state whose existence we're supposed to pretend isn't there. So Biden represents a return to that natural state of American empire, where poor old Barack Obama the most powerful man, who was the most powerful man in the world for 8 years, just, what are you going to do? He wanted to help these guys, but he just had to kill them. He didn't really have a choice. What are you going to do? It's like, I wanted to, but this machinery. I mean, it's funny because Obama is acknowledging in that passage, which has been shared a lot. People have been posting it, and utter horror at sort of the sociopathy of it. Um, that Obama is acknowledging or blaming a machinery that he is claiming is bigger and essentially more powerful than him. So isn't that Obama actually acknowledging the existence of a deep state that even he claims he can't control?
Yeah, I mean, that was the most refreshing passage in a way that I've seen in his book. And it highlights what Trump is up against and what Biden is not up against. I saw Samantha Power tweet that Samantha Power, being the former undersecretary of R2P intervention, or just, she always had this made up State Department position for her, and then she was UN ambassador for the US. But she tweeted, "It'll be really inspiring to see Tony Blinken raised 2 toddler children while he's in the State Department to many parents out there." And I thought, and I tweeted it too. I said, it'll also be inspiring to middle-aged people who are taking care of elderly parents as they drift off into dementia, which is what these foreign policy national security advisors are going to be doing, in contrast to a lot of the people like John Bolton around Trump, where their job was actually to kind of wrestle him into submission and dominate him and undercut him and leak on him at every turn. I mean, we really saw for the first time, maybe since JFK, the deep state's revenge under Trump. And when I think of America's back, I think of I don't know if you ever had a roommate who would always eat your food, and there was just always a bad vibe, and they were passive aggressive. And then when they'd go out of town for 2 weeks to visit their family for Thanksgiving or whatever, then they come back and it's like, America's back. Shit. The problem is, under Trump, America hasn't really gone away. Hundreds of thousands have died, probably. We don't have the exact numbers of excess deaths from all the ruthless sanctions that have been imposed on Iran, on Venezuela. And I don't see much hope of these sanctions being rolled back, maybe on Iran, an Iran deal. But we don't really have concrete evidence that there won't be continuity from Trump's foreign policy to Biden's foreign policy. And that's why I think we see so much emphasis on the personal characteristics of these national security picks, as well as on, people like Kamala Harris being, the first Black female vice president. I saw Karen Attiah from the Washington Post, chirp about how the vice presidential couple will be this inspiring interracial couple, and that the husband, a white man, Douglas Emhoff, is quitting his job in service to Kamala Harris's job. He's just respecting the letting a Black woman's voice just resonate through America. No, that's not what's happening. He is a corporate lawyer for a top Beltway lobbying firm, DLA Piper, which has contracts with Qualcomm and the governments of Azerbaijan and Afghanistan. And he's just taking a moment. He's probably going to take a government job to lean back while his wife leans into a position that will grant him more lucrative contracts when he's out of office. And it's the same across the board. Michelle Flournoy being a woman, Tony Blinken being Jewish and the son of a Holocaust survivor. When you look at the actual details of their personal characteristics, it's to elide the startling reality of the policy positions that they're pushing. And I think, Marco Rubio is kind of right when he calls them polite, well-mannered managers of American decline. I would say they'll be polite, well-mannered managers of American empire. And if you criticize that, well, you're a sexist and you're a racist.
Yeah, and on Kamala Harris's husband, I've read, I think it was in the New York Times, that they reported that he is planning to take a formal role in the administration. They said that that's still being discussed, exactly what projects he's going to work on. But I think, that can be seen as a continuation of the Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner model, where, family members are given official roles in the administration. And like you say, all of this, the model of government we have in this country is that people go into so-called public service for a couple of years, and then they come out and they monetize the government contacts and connections they made into massive personal fortunes.
Yep.
This is what Rahm Emanuel did after he left the Clinton White House. He went away into the investment banking world and made a huge fortune. This is what Barack Obama has done. How do you, after being a so-called community organizer and then a president of the United States, of course, it's a very powerful role, but then within a couple of years, he's $100 millionaire. And the Clintons are worth what now? $200 million, maybe? I mean, this is now the norm that
Well,
any.
can I just ask you real quick, just because you brought up Rahm and Obama and their, and the fact that you're in Chicago, that you actually knew Obama or would see him around back when he was a community organizer on his trajectory to being president. I mean, since Obama's kind of come back to Chicago and started this, he's in Martha's Vineyard, but he has the Obama Foundation, and Rahm has been mayor of Chicago. And now they're kind of both, Rahm is poised to enter a Biden administration, and Obama is really the power behind the throne. I think you could, do you think it's fair to say you could look at Chicago and what they've done and are doing there as kind of a microcosm of their neoliberal vision? And, how has the city changed under their watch?
Yeah, in many ways, it is unfortunately a microcosm. Remember that one of the first things that Rahm Emanuel did when he came in was to shut down 50 schools and, to strip the city's, mental health services and other services, which was part of making way for massive gentrification across the city, which we've seen. Of course, that's happening all over the country, but you definitely see it in Chicago. And then the Obama Foundation is sort of gentrification on steroids. It's supposed to be built in the South Side near the University of Chicago, but in what is a mostly working class Black neighborhood. And there has been a lot of local opposition and local organizing against it, because the first thing is it's going to destroy a public park, which is unprecedented. Parkland in Chicago is supposed to be sacrosanct, and Rahm Emanuel handed his buddy Obama a piece of Jackson Park to build his private foundation, which unlike other presidential centers, is not going to be under the auspices of the National Archives. So it's a completely private Obama front group. And the other element, of course, is the massive gentrification, the so-called Obama effect, which goes with that. And a couple of years ago, when Obama first chose the site, there was a lot of on-the-ground organizing, lawsuits by Friends of the Park and others. And you'd see that, and then there was this massive organized pro-Obama Hasbara campaign or propaganda campaign, where there were actual billboards or bus shelter advertisements singing the praises of Obama and the Obama Foundation and just steamrolling. It's really, I have photos of them. I went through the neighborhood and just took photos of this sort of big budget pro-Obama advertising campaign, which was just designed to steamroll any of the opposition. And then remember that, Rahm Emanuel did not run for another term because he saw the writing on the wall after it emerged that he had helped suppress the video of the police murder of Laquan McDonald, just until after his second election victory. So he managed to win by suppressing that video. Had that video come out before, it's unlikely he would have won. But that was the context for why he didn't run for re-election again. So that pair, Obama and Rahm Emanuel, really do represent the absolute worst of a Democratic Party neoliberalism. The sweet talking, soft tones that you get from a Bill Clinton or a Barack Obama, just combined with the iron fist of bulldozing over poor people. You look at the Obama Foundation board; it's all private equity people. That's who their real constituency is, while they still present themselves as somehow champions of the poor. But hey, at least those Chicago public school kids get a free PDF of Obama's unreadable 800-page book. So it's something, right?
Well, that's part of his propaganda campaign. It's an ongoing campaign against the city of Chicago, where the community is organizing against Obama, the former community organizer.
Yeah, and and going back, maybe we're going a little off topic, but since Obama is back in the news, I've been thinking about a lot of these things recently that I had not thought about for a few years. I didn't know Obama when he was a community organizer. I knew him when he was my local Illinois state senator. And I did meet him a number of times at various events. He was never a close friend, but I had conversations with him. And what was clear to me, I think, at first I was a little bit taken in by his sweet talking, because up close he's very good. He's a very effective speaker. He kind of mesmerizes people. But once you see through it, there's really no going back. And I saw through it, I think, before a lot of people did. I certainly wasn't the first. Someone like Adolph Reed famously saw through Obama in the mid-90s. It took me a little bit longer. But, once I did and saw just what a complete and utter fraud he was, and there was this pattern again and again of Obama taking another step up the rung of, American social class and power, and every single time leaving disenfranchised and angry and betrayed people behind him. And you saw it time and again. And there were stories about, reporting from before he, when he was still emerging as a candidate, about when he edited the Harvard Law Review. And all the black, the very few black law students at Harvard all supported him. And then the first thing he did when he won, the position of editor of the Harvard Law Review was put all the right-wingers who'd opposed him into editorial positions. So that pattern has been there from the beginning. And then in terms of the community activism, right at the beginning, there was reporting where they actually went to Altgeld Gardens, the housing project where he was supposedly a community activist. And people spoke out, and they said that the account he gave in what was his earlier autobiography, Dreams from My Father, the account he gave was wrong, and he gave himself way too much credit, and he airbrushed out all these other people, and people were really angry. But then once his campaign started to gather steam, I don't know what happened. The campaign came in and shut all that down, and you never heard any of that criticism again. But that's just that same pattern and that same propaganda is going on anyway.
Yeah, Ben, I'll toss to you, but I think we should keep going with this Obama thread, because Obama's really his success, or his relative success, his perceived success, is the template for Biden. It was his power and influence over the Democratic Party that cleared the field for Biden and destroyed Bernie Sanders. And it is Obama's image that is being transposed onto Biden's national security team and all of his cabinet picks and influential advisory appointees to deploy identity politics and all of this phony historicity language to paper over the real policy ramifications of the neoliberalism they represent. So I mean he has released this new memoir, and I don't know if either of you have any reaction to anything you've read from it. Does it change your view of him? And obviously it's been released at a time when the Biden camp is putting forward this message of America's back, this terrible interregnum in American history is over, and now we're back to what's normal after we were screaming this is not normal. So Obama's establishing what's normal. So do either of you have any reaction to anything you've read out of his memoir?
Yeah, well, I mean, you kind of referenced this a bit, but I think it's just worth taking a closer look. I mean, this is, of course, like Obama's 12th memoir. I mean, how many of these has he written? But
yeah, he has as many as Ayaan Hirsi Ali.
Yeah, and as evil as he is, he's accomplished infinitely more than her. I mean, but she just lied about her entire life and failed up to a job at Harvard. But anyway, back to Obama. If you look at his memoir, I think one of the most telling parts, which is definitely informs, I think, what the tenor of the Biden administration will be, particularly on foreign policy, is when Obama talks about the war on terror. And there was a pretty good review of this that drew attention to a quote that I actually hadn't even heard of, that in 2011, Obama apparently told his top aides, this is an exact quote, "Turns out I'm really good at killing people. Didn't know that was going to be a strong suit of mine." So, I mean, Ali was talking about the kind of sociopathy of Obama, and there you go. Turns out I'm really good at killing people. But related to that, I mean, Max mentioned some of the quotes about the drone war. There's another quote that didn't get as much attention, but I think is really important, and it's where Obama comes in office and he's talking about Bush's so-called war on terror, which, for opportunistic reasons, Obama, people remember that in his first term, he ran kind of against the war on Iraq specifically. He also pledged to end the war in Afghanistan by 2014. He, of course, did not do that. But there's a quote in his new memoir in which Obama says, quote, "Unlike some on the left, I had never engaged in wholesale condemnation of the Bush administration's approach to counterterrorism." So basically what he says is that there were elements of the Bush war on terror that he actually totally agreed with. And that makes sense when you look at his actual record, because he's continued many of the same policies. So I think when you look at what the Obama-Biden administration did, and what's interesting is if you look at a lot of the speeches and interviews being given by Antony Blinken, who we now know is going to be Secretary of State, Blinken repeatedly uses that phrase specifically, Obama-Biden administration, Obama-Biden administration, trying to take credit for the Obama administration. And I'd be like, sure, go for it, take credit, because the Blinken forces, these liberal interventionist forces, Samantha Power kind of people, they're proud actually of what they did in the Obama administration. They're proud of the war in Libya. They still think, even if they might criticize elements of it, they still think that it was the right decision to make, destroying the Libyan state. Still today, at 9 years later, there is no Libyan state. There's still a civil war going on. How many thousands of people have died? How many tens or hundreds of thousands of Libyans have been displaced? How many black Africans were ethnically cleansed by these so-called rebels backed by NATO? And meanwhile, they think, I mean, Obama did slightly criticize the war in Libya, but Obama only did it in a way where he said, I still agreed with the decision to have military intervention, NATO intervention in Libya, but I think what we did after, our mistake was that we didn't prepare for after. That was the worst part of his administration. So we see this attempt not only to rehabilitate Obama by Obama himself in his memoir, by his own administration officials, by people who are now going to be in the Biden camp, but we actually see them taking credit for it as if it's an example of positive things they've done. So I don't see any sign of them actually changing those policies. If anything, they have stated every intention to just continue those exact same policies of the Obama-Biden administration.
Ali, did any passage of the book strike you as especially noteworthy or repulsive?
Yeah, well, I admit I haven't read the whole thing. I did get a copy because I wanted to see what he wrote about specifically Palestine, Israel, and the so-called peace process. And what struck me in those passages was, and I think this is probably true of the bits of the rest of the book I've seen, but it's certainly true of the Israel-Palestine stuff, is that there's no sense that Obama ever learns anything. You know, that he is the same Obama of way back when. I wrote an article in 2007 called "How Barack Obama Learned to Love Israel." If people search for that, they'll find it.
I love the header image on that article. It's Obama in Sderot with all of the rockets.
Right. But what struck me was that, you know, all the things I quoted Obama saying in 2007 and before about Palestine, because remember, people had this idea that this was a progressive guy, that he was a pro-Palestinian guy, that he was against the wars. And the point of that article in 2007 was to warn people that, no, if you actually pay attention to what he says and not how he makes you feel, you see that the substance is actually the opposite of what you think. And he ran in 2007 to the right of George W. Bush when it came to Palestine. Remember, George W. Bush, the Bush administration, had supported allowing Palestinians to have elections, which Hamas won. Of course, then the Bush administration turned around and tried to mount a coup against Hamas for winning the elections. But Barack Obama didn't even support having the elections in the first place. He was against allowing Palestinians to vote. And that's just an example. And you find exactly the same rhetoric in his book in 2020 as you do from him in 2006 and 2007 about Sderot and about Israeli children under the terror of Hamas rockets. And he doesn't even mention, for example, the 551 Palestinian children killed during the 51-day Israeli assault on Gaza in 2014, during which the Obama administration released to Israel missiles and bombs from its strategic stockpile that is pre-positioned in Israel to make sure that Benjamin Netanyahu would not run out of bombs when he was killing an average of 11 children per day in the Gaza Strip. Obama does not even mention those kids that he helped Benjamin Netanyahu to kill. And that's just, so that's the thing that is so striking to me, is that there is no real reflection, there is no insight, there's no sense that, well, this is what I learned and this is what we should have done. It's as if nothing has changed. It's as if history of the last 12 years hasn't happened.
It really does bring me back to 2007, 2008, where I just felt this constant weight, this feeling of revulsion, like just constantly in my stomach, because I was around The Nation magazine at that time, and I just saw the white liberal worship of Obama because of the historic representative force that he embodied, and not because of any policies that he was proposing, because he was telling you straight up he was going to AIPAC. And Dennis Ross was writing his speech and he said, I support an undivided Jerusalem. He was telling you straight up that he was going to let Israel steal all the land it wanted while it painted him as a crypto-Muslim. He was appointing all of these pro-NAFTA advisors and telling you straight up he's going to do TPP. He was just all the neoliberalism that you wanted, that that Wall Street wanted, that the war state wanted. He was promising it to them openly. And yet people at The Nation just worshiped him. There's this tweet that was resurrected by Chris Hayes, the MSNBC host, who was around The Nation at that time. He actually wrote The Nation's first endorsement of Obama. One endorsement wasn't enough. They actually had to write two. And Chris Hayes said, like, Washington has been invaded by beautiful black people, like a master race of beautiful black people. I wish they would stay. And it's such a bizarre tweet, especially today. And he wrote it on Inauguration Day, the day that Obama was inaugurated. And I remember seeing all these white liberals around Washington just crying, like their souls were finally purified of their ancestors' genocidal racism or something, because they had elected this guy and his wife. And that was really what it felt like. That's what people were like around The Nation and in so-called progressive media. And, you know, if you said otherwise, you were run out. I mean, I just had to self-censor. That's why I felt so, because I was still kind of on my way up. I wasn't sure where I stood. And I just felt like I had to self-censor, because you would be boycotted and blacklisted if you spoke out against Obama from the left at that time. And you would be called a straight up racist. And I mean, it was funny. They had this campaign against Hillary Clinton that she was a huge racist, but then as soon as Obama made her Secretary of State, they were like, yeah, slay queen, literally slay queen. And that's the feeling now, the shaming of everyone who didn't support Biden, because then that means you're a crypto Trump supporter. And here we go again. The same people, the same policies, the same progressive pundits supporting it all, patting each other on the back, and particularly the same pro-Israel characters who are dead set on dooming Palestine even further. So there's one passage that jumped out to me that you tweeted, Ali, from Obama's book. Where he attacks editorializing from Al Jazeera. I'm reading the direct quote. The Qatari-controlled media outlet that had become the dominant news source in the region, having built its popularity by fanning the flames of anger and resentment among Arabs with the same algorithmic precision that Fox News deployed so skillfully. So basically, Obama was president. As you mentioned, he presided over more disproportionate violence against Palestinians than any other president in history, rearming Israel with not only 2,000, but I think 5,000-pound bunker busters in the middle of the 2014 Gaza slaughter, which I covered. And here he is blaming Al Jazeera and an algorithm for Palestinian anger when he should just simply look in the mirror at himself. I remember at The Nation, everyone was like, well, he knew Ali Abu Nima in Chicago. He knew Rashid Khalidi. He knew Palestinians, so it's going to be good. And now we see 8 years of nonstop slaughter and annexation, and Obama's still their hero. I wanted to bring up just one figure to get you to respond, who's going to be in a Biden administration, I think, who is one of Biden's top Middle East advisors, who is Obama's UN ambassador to Israel. And he was at the Westech consulting firm with Tony Blinken, the incoming likely Secretary of State, and Michelle Flournoy, who's likely to be appointed defense secretary. What this firm did was help Silicon Valley sell its programs to the Pentagon. And it's Daniel Shapiro. I think he's a significant figure because, we see everyone saying, oh, Trump, he was so like overly pro-Israel and just owned by Netanyahu. But who is Daniel Shapiro, and what does his presence in a Biden administration represent from the perspective of Palestinians?
Yeah, well, Shapiro, of course, as you mentioned, was in his most recent government role, Obama's ambassador to Israel. And in that role, he was just like the most gung-ho pro-Israel. I mean, the thing is with a lot of these ambassadors is it's very hard to tell which country they're supposed to represent, because the Israeli ambassadors to the United States are actually Americans most of the time. Ron Dermer, the current one, the most recent one. I don't know if he still is, but Ron Dermer is, a Florida native who renounced his citizenship to become the Israeli ambassador to the U.S., just like Michael Oren before him, a New York native who renounced his U.S. citizenship to become Israeli ambassador to Washington. And so, these guys all work together, and they're all basically Americans, and some on paper represent the United States, and some on paper represent Israel, but really their roles are indistinguishable. They're like two-way ambassadors. And that was certainly the impression you got from Shapiro. I remember at one point, I think he deleted this. I've tried to find it since then, but I think he deleted it. He deleted he tweeted a cake in the shape of the F-35 fighter jet that was delivered to Israel on his watch. I mean, just like the sociopathy, you're going to make a cake in the shape of a warplane that is going to be used to kill innocent people across the region. To me, that just represented the just utterly depraved mindset. And what is so interesting about Shapiro is that when Obama's term ended and he stopped being ambassador, he stayed in Israel. He didn't come back to the United States. He basically moved to Israel and became an influence peddler. So he then joined some investment banking firm or some advisory firm that is basically influence peddling, the same model as all these other ex-officials. So, if I don't know what.
Well, wait a minute. Didn't he work for, what is it, INSS, or like the Institute for National Security Studies, which is funded by the Israeli state?
He has an affiliation with them. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but he appears on their panels or writes for them. But that's just one of his gigs. The main gig, probably the one that makes most of the money, is his role as an advisor to some investment or private equity firm from Israel. So he never came back to the United States. So it'll be interesting to see. Is he going to come back to the United States to take up a role in a Biden administration, or is he just going to move across town in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv or wherever he lives into official U.S. government digs to take up a role there? We'll have to see. But he really, he's the other thing about Shapiro. I mean, I judge him basically from his tweets. This is how I kind of form my impressions of him, is that he also plays the role. There was this sort of performative or fake opposition when Trump moved the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, for example, or recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital, or recognized the Golan Heights, which is actually part of Syria, when Trump recognized it as part of Israel. Shapiro would sort of write these pieces or do these threads of tweets about, maybe the timing isn't right, but actually this is a good thing. In other words, all the Obama people, the Clinton peace process people, my impression is they love everything Trump did. They're not going to be pushing for Biden to unrecognize Jerusalem. They're not going to be pushing for Biden to move the U.S. embassy back. They're not going to be pushing for Biden to unrecognize Israeli settlements in the West Bank, because that's been their agenda all along. The Dennis Rosses, the Martin Indyks, the Daniel Shapiros, the Clinton-Obama peace processes always had this phrase that they would use, which is that everybody knows what a final agreement will look like. They would say that everyone knows, hint, hint, which would mean Palestinians would have to give up any claim on Jerusalem. They'd have to give up the right of return. They'd have to accept most, if not all, of the Israeli settlements built illegally on their land. And that, in essence, is what Trump's so-called deal of the century is. It is the fulfillment of everything the Clinton and Obama and George W. Bush, to be fair, peace processes were putting out there. So they always play an enabling role. They never actually opposed what Trump did. They would say, well, maybe the timing's not right, or I wouldn't quite do it in this way, or here's how we can make it work. that they would always do these kind of process critiques of what Trump was doing for Israel, but they would never draw a line because ultimately they support it.
Absolutely. I was just looking at it, just came across my screen, Democracy Now! Praising the Biden national security appointments for their focus on multilateralism and international cooperation. So they definitely have a lot of cover there. I was also, in watching the press conference where, the Biden national security picks so far presented their credentials and their inspiring, like personal stories. Tony Blinken talked about this. I actually saw him tell the same story in a video I watched where he was giving an apparently paid talk to Goldman Sachs. So it's like a well-worn story. You just kind of change it, change it. It's sort of unchanged. It's like, when you're a stand-up comedian and you have to do the same jokes again and again and hope the audience didn't hear him before. But he talks about his stepfather who had raised him since he was like 9 years old. And his inspiring survival, which was it genuinely inspiring to survive the Holocaust and the Nazi death camps, and his rescue by an American tank division and a black man getting out of the hatch of the tank. And he says the only words he knew, I don't know if this is true, he said, "God bless America," the only words he knew in English. And it gives you the impression that, first of all, the military is a great equalizer, racial equalizer, that the U.S. ended the Holocaust, and that Tony Blinken comes from humble roots, that his father was just a victim of persecution his whole life, when in fact his father was a really prominent member of the global elite, Samuel Pisar. He was a prominent lawyer for celebrities, corporate industrialists, and Robert Maxwell. He wasn't just Robert Maxwell's lawyer. He was his personal fixer, his confidant. Robert Maxwell was considered an Israeli super agent and a top publisher in the UK. And he, most notoriously is the father of Ghislaine Maxwell, the sort of partner of Jeffrey Epstein in crime, in sex trafficking. Robert Maxwell died mysteriously after falling off a yacht, I think in the Mediterranean. And the last person that he spoke to by phone was Samuel Pisar. Samuel Pisar said the Kaddish for Robert Maxwell at his quasi-state funeral in Jerusalem, which was attended by a who's who of, fellow elites and Israeli statespeople. I mean, he was close to Mitterrand. So you think about, it tells you two things about Tony Blinken. Number one, it's not like he got to where he was through his sheer brilliance and the meritocracy. He was already there. Number two, he's got a pretty close relationship with Israel that he inherited. And when he goes to the American Jewish Congress, or what is it, the American Jewish Committee, and says, Israel is an indispensable security partner, or when he's asked, will Biden, like Bernie Sanders, condition aid to Israel on abiding by international law? And he says, hell no, we're not going to impose any conditions on Israel. So basically, we're going to do exactly what Obama did to them. Get really upset in private and then just keep giving the aid packages to them. These connections and these relationships and this history really matters. And I think with Tony Blinken, it goes beyond just kind of the usual transactional and efficacy and that people treat Israel with in Washington, where you just can't challenge the Goliath and you need to work with Israel or they'll screw you over. It's actually very deeply personal for him. And this is troubling to me. And why hasn't it been mentioned anywhere in any media outlet that this is who his stepfather actually was?
Well, I mean, we can say, although he did bring up his stepfather in his in his statement when Biden officially presented him, but nonetheless, we can say, even if we don't hold the sins of the stepfather against the son. Blinken's record on Israel is very clear. You've quoted some of what he said, and his record previously in office doesn't give us any reason to think he's suddenly going to, be an advocate for Palestinian rights. And in terms of one of the Obama administration's final acts, remember that when Obama came in January 2009, Israel had been bombing the Gaza Strip relentlessly for the previous 3 weeks, and they stopped the bombing just 2 days, before Obama was inaugurated. And throughout that time, Obama said absolutely nothing and came up with this line, which has been used ever since. I think it was the first time it was used back then, specifically to get him out of saying something about Israel slaughtering people in Gaza, which is, he said, we only have one president at a time. You remember that? Of course, that didn't stop him from talking about all kinds of other issues. It only kept him quiet when it came to Gaza. But then his final act on leaving office was to approve or to agree with Israel on the biggest military aid package in history, in the history of humanity, which is a minimum of $38 billion over 10 years, which started, 4 or 5 years ago. So the first thing as soon as Netanyahu took his time to recognize Biden's victory, he kind of hedged his bets. He waited until, a bunch of European leaders had all congratulated Biden. Then Netanyahu did. And then immediately in the Israeli media, there were statements from senior Israeli defense officials saying, oh, we're really excited to, we'll be contacting the Biden administration within the next few months to start negotiating the next military aid package for the next 10 years, which will have to take into account, all the developments in the region. And what is that? Which is that, for example, the United Arab Emirates, as a reward for normalizing its ties with Israel, is going to get F-35 warplanes and other military goodies. So Israel's going to have to come to Biden and say, well, now that the UAE has all these advanced weapons, we need even more if we're to maintain our qualitative military edge. So it becomes Israel wins on both sides of that deal. They win through the normalization with the UAE, and they win through being able to then up their demands from the US. So I don't know what it's going to be. If it was 38 billion minimum, because that's just the baseline of what the US is guaranteeing to give Israel, they often put extra packages on top of that. So if it's going to be a $38 billion minimum for Obama, what's it going to be for Biden? 50 billion, 60 billion, who knows?
Ben, you did a series of reports for us on some figures who are in the Biden national security circles, and one who will be Biden's national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, but also Michael Morell, on their relationships with the UAE, which were apparent business relationships through this Beacon consulting firm. I don't know if you remember the details off the top because it was a few years ago, but I think that's pretty relevant here.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very relevant. People might remember Mike Morell. He's briefly served as acting director of the CIA. He gave an interview in which he was asked what he would do to try to turn up the heat on Russia and Iran, and he explicitly said, kill Russians and kill Iranians. And he said, we could do it kind of indirectly, but we need to kill them. So this is a guy who's calling for proxy war with Russia and Iran.
In Syria.
Through Syria. This is also a guy who endorsed Hillary Clinton. So totally just this neoconservative kind of CIA, national security state apparatchik. But yeah, the fact that he was very close friends with Yusuf al-Otaiba, who is the Emirati ambassador to the United States, a very influential man in Washington who was charismatic, knows how to make friends and rub elbows. And the fact is that there are these leaked emails that probably came from Qatar. This is after the blockade of Qatar, the Saudi Emirati blockade at the beginning of the Trump administration, and there were these emails leaked from Otaiba's personal email account showing that, this is how it works in DC, that Morel and all these other figures around Otaiba were trying to get Emirati investment. The UAE has one of the largest sovereign wealth funds in the world. I believe it's the fourth largest on earth in terms of many trillions of dollars of wealth. So it just shows that it's very similar to what some of these people like Blinken have been doing in the interim, right? Between the Obama and the new Biden administration. There was a really good report looking at how these people have all been enriching themselves, Blinken and others, as these corporate consultants working with defense contractors and other massive corporations to basically just levy they exploit the contacts they have in Washington and in government, and then try to get corporate contracts for these massive companies, and then they take a cut of it. I mean, it's extremely corrupt, but it shows that even among the enlightened Democrats who consider themselves to be progressive, they're just as corrupt as I think the Trump folks are, but the difference is that they're much more sophisticated about it. And once again, it shows that, just as Ali was saying, when it comes to their policies, they basically share the exact same policy. The difference is not in the substance. The difference is always in the presentation and the marketing and the aesthetics of it. So, and that's what liberals, that's all they care about in the United States and in large parts of Western Europe. They just care about the rhetoric and the marketing and not the actual substance of the issue. So I think once again, we can expect to see the same exact policies.
I texted you yesterday about your articles because, they'd originally been published at Alternet. I wanted to make sure they were on the Gray Zone site. And you told me that the emails, which were like hacked or phished emails, which show all of these interactions between Michael Morell, who is possibly the next CIA director, and Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor to Biden, and the UAE ambassador in Washington, Youssef Otaiba, who's, one of the most influential hustlers in Washington. And, they're pretty damning emails. And you told me that the Scribd document that contained all the emails that we had embedded in the article had been deleted mysteriously.
Yeah, it was removed by the website Scribd. And there's no note. There's just one line, and it says, "This was removed by Scribd." So we don't know why. We don't know who pressured them. I'm guessing, of course, that it seems likely that it was Otaiba's lawyers, Emirati lawyers, who were pressuring Scribd, saying this is violating his privacy or something to that effect. But, I mean, it just shows that the power that these forces have in Washington and among the kind of corporate elite in the United States, because the UAE is one of the richest countries per capita in the entire world.
Well, Michael Morell, it might have been him as well. He demonstrated his influence by getting Chelsea Manning booted from Harvard when she was granted a visiting fellowship by Harvard. And so instead, Harvard students got treated to the brilliance of Michael Morell and Sean Spicer, with no one with the kind of experience like Chelsea Manning. But staying on this thread of Scribd, a Silicon Valley company, basically self-censoring at the service of powerful state interests. I'll toss it to both of you, but first, Ben, you should talk briefly about Richard Stengel, who's the chief propagandist, self-described chief propagandist for U.S. state media, is now at the U.S. Agency for Global Media, and has said that the First Amendment needs to be rolled back. And this is kind of consistent with the general sensibility of many of the disinformation warriors who want to suppress what the American public can see or hear because they blame social media and what they call fake news for the rise of Donald Trump, but also for all these alternative media sites which contravene U.S. foreign policy interests. And Ali, you've written about how Zoom has begun censoring Palestinian webinars, preventing Palestinian webinars from taking place, apparently under pressure from the Israel lobby. So, I guess either you can jump in, but is this kind of, are we going to see an escalation of this. I mean, I've already said it. There will be an escalation in the next 4 years of this kind of censorship.
All right, so we're going to take a pause here. That is the end to part one of our interview with Ali Abunimah, who is the executive director of the website, the really great independent news website, Electronic Intifada. Definitely check him out. You can find him on Twitter at Ali Abunimah, and you can find his website, The Electronic Intifada. In part two of this episode, we're going to talk about what's going on in France, which should be getting way more coverage in mainstream U.S. media, but is not. Emmanuel Macron, the centrist neoliberal president who has been praised, was beloved by American neoliberal politicians and Democratic Party apparatchiks, he is just going full-on authoritarian, cracking down hard with these Marine Le Pen-style Islamophobic policies and authoritarian policies. So definitely check us in part two. And if you want to support this show, you can go to Patreon. That is patreon.com/Moderate Rebels. We are very grateful for all of the support. It helps to keep this show going. And see you next time. We're out.